Hello everyone, Kurt over here, and welcome back to another episode from Hopefitter Labs. Today we're going to continue on with Fiory's Armazzari, and we are moving into the topic and conversation of armor. Now, a big thing about the armored portion of Fiory's Armazzari is that I believe he is trying to give more context that already that he's to the rest of the manuscripts. It is inherently evident with me the more that I've practiced in the context of unarmored and armored conflict, that essentially Fiory's works are ones that work both in conjunction with each other, but also special case situations. So why he has a specific concept right here about someone in and out of armor is that, and to me, it's not just about an armor on armor fight per se, but it could very well be a situation that is where you are in a lesser armored situation or they're in a heavier armored situation or vice versa that you are containing with. And the reason why I say this is because consistently throughout the images of the Getty, we see people in mismatched shapes of armor. So it doesn't necessarily mean that there was equality of kit of the time, and that people essentially came to what they have with these types of, these martial conflicts with what they had. And again, those that had more money could probably afford better equipment. The other part too I want to talk about here, and this is a growing hypothesis I have with me as far as why the postures and structures of Fiory's armored section is also earlier on as well, why he tends to be so offline. And I'm very curious to see what people have to say about this. Please note that when it comes down to the practice of armor, I pretty much am a diehard in the Getty, Poseidon, whatever. I'm a diehard practice of what Fiory puts out there, and I haven't really dabbled a lot with other armor concepts. And that just kind of serves my purpose for training and whatnot. So please understand that this is some of the things that I have seen and observed, but I have not readily trained with later traditions. And I would ask those people who have potentially to please give me your feedback on this, because I'm very curious about that, because I do think that there's a reason why we start seeing offline positionings kind of going away as armor progresses, and why it's so important for Fiory in his time frame to be offline. So we'll talk about that here in a bit. So to begin with this whole topic of conversation here, I want to talk about the period of time itself. And I'm going to be flashing pictures across here as I do this right here, just to kind of get people's thoughts on this and hear so you can kind of hear where my mind is at. My present suit that I utilize right now, that I've been trying to build towards what I believe would have been Fiory's the 1380s to 1390s setup, is what's being displayed on the screen right now. It's not as robust as, say, some of the other later periods that you see out there, where you have lots of other pieces on there. But it is incredibly covered for what the purpose is, and it's also very mobile too. My experience with helmets is also a part right here that really kind of goes to different things here. Where again, we in the modern era, we obviously are using visors to protect ourselves, but in this period of time, it's been informed to me, and it's also shown within the manuscript, one, straps that you have around the helmet are not necessarily historically accurate concepts. It's a modernism that keeps things in tight. Now, of course, for bevers and other things out there that may have been utilized for the joust, you'd see wraps that came around to the back portion, and there's a rondelle on the back of the helmet. But as far as like the helmet visor itself, many times you see push buttons, or they just lifted up, hinges up top right here, and it really kind of depends on what you have as far as the kit itself. And I think that's a big part right here that's important to look at first here, is that essentially that armor itself is like the visor. They may or may not have had a visor in conflict. And that is a big part right here to consider when you look at what Fiory is doing and why he might be choosing to be offline and utilizing some of the tactics that he does. So again, and mind you, I'm not saying that no one had visors. I'm just saying that that combatants may or may not have had visors, and they may have been situational. Maybe they could be taken off. As a military guy, I know that was some of the things we had with our own body armor. We'd augment things, take off things, and it was very modular, because the reality is not every situation required certain levels of kit, And I believe it was probably the same thing here for when it comes down to Fiory's period of time. So as you can see with this armor here, again, like I'm very well covered for the most part. But I would also say too that this is probably a little bit more on the, I would imagine, more on the robust side of his period of time. And again, nothing wrong with that whatsoever. But it does give perspective. I have done other shoots and footage out there where I don't have the folds, the brigandine folds that are on that are right beneath the breastplate, and instead I've had just a breastplate on me, and then legs and arms, and then very limited shoulders as far as what I have for protection up there. And those are all parts right there that really favor to how I like to fight. Now, an important piece about this is that essentially the armor set that I have here is very heavily inspired by the Kerber 13, but I don't want an exact replica. One thing that I try to do with my practices, again, this is the thing right here for me, is that in order to get into the practice of armor, I look at the technologies of the time, and I work very hard to build a suit that is mine. I'm not saying to have fantasy stuff out there and whatnot, but the reality is armor is an expression of a person, and it is something out there that is very, it's unique to the person, not to mention also the resources of the area. You can see this within the Getty too, because a lot of times people, when they do get in the armor practice, they try to replicate effigies. And I think this is a very noble way of doing this, because you can look at this, you have an idea, this is what their best suit would have been like when they're laid to rest. And that's a big part right here that is kind of important to understand as far as what you're dealing with. But the thing about that is, if you look at some of the images within the Getty, and we'll talk about these postures later on, you'll notice that he's got spikes on certain portions of it all. He's got helmets that don't necessarily latch in, and as far as that goes. Sometimes it looks like he's just wearing a gambeson that's probably more of a padded coat of some nature that's covering a smaller piece of armor on him. So armor itself is it's unique, and it's in armor itself, just like training anything else within the traditions of Armansari, needs to be refined and practiced. So when you learn how to use a sword or a lance or an axe or a dagger, those take reps and sets. Using armor requires the same thing, because even though it is protective equipment, it is also a weapon. It can be used against you. It can be used for you. And it has its own weights and values that change how you feel in general. So that's a big part about that right there, that within our class structure, we really try to reinforce the notion that, hey, armor itself is a practice of arms. So moving down to the list of what we have there, you can see, again, a lot of the shoulders may have been a little bit bigger as far as the period of time goes. I got this from Honor Craft, and from what I can tell, they're really good. I fought in this quite a bit, and it's quite robust, and it works for what I want to do. But the spaulders that are on there, they may be a little bit bigger for what this period of time would have been. But then again, we don't necessarily know. You can also tell right here that the arms are essentially opened to the bicep area, and the chainmail floats over top of it. These right here is oftentimes I hear people in a modern context talk about utilizing an Italian style or Italian weave, where the arm harness comes up underneath the chainmail, and that's really layering a lot of stuff right there, which allows the arms to really be attached to the body, as far as my opinion. But again, depends about how you like to do the fighting. And also remember, historically, it would have been the fashion of the time. And that's the big part about this right here. The legs, you can see in there, they cover up quite a bit, and as far as all the way down to the ankles, the shin balls. And I just recently learned this right here: shin balls versus greaves. Greaves are fully in cases, whereas a shin ball is something that just legitimately just protects the shin, and that's all that really covers there. So that's some of the big parts about this. And the reason why I love this suit of armor right here is it's in a time period where armor is starting to augment mail, and chainmail is not nothing. Okay, so I think one of the things I had difficulty in understanding when it came into armor is that chainmail is not some low line of defense. It's not ineffective at all. It's quite effective. And if you've seen some of the ranges I've done out there with Aaron and Brandy, you see how we're just cutting into cloth is difficult, and just trying to stab through these things with daggers and whatnot is difficult. So you can see those videos right here, and I'll link it in the description down below. But you can see how, again, those right there, it's not, chainmail is an augment. Personally, I think each piece of armor is utilized for different levels of things, okay? While absolutely steel can have percussive, repulsion, it is not necessarily the part that is, it doesn't stop impact. It's not like modern day impact-based armor. it's deflective. And personally, if you look at the picture, how I'm standing frontward this, you can see how, again, essentially the breastplate is in front, right? And it's rounded. Well, as we start talking about the weak points of armor here in a little bit, you'll notice that essentially hitting straight on puts the spear or whatever point you have, pointed weapon, into the weak points of the armor. And that kind of dome that looks like this, if my head is right here and I flip it down like here, right? That offers deflection. And by rotating it, we start to get a much more square face, which optimizes defense in structure. And again, this is why I think offline positioning for Fiore's period of time is so important, because it's that offline positioning allows for rotations and deflection. Really fast here, as far as the different types of categorizations of armor. This is a Curtism. I don't know if we're ever going to find anything in a manuscript, and I'd really loved if we did. But in purpose and intent of armor is also very important. So let's talk about purpose and intent. So like I said before, plate. Plate to me is augmented. It's augmented to chainmail because you're talking about deflection. So plate itself is also a striking pattern. So if you talk about first master dagger or anything else where you go into an arm, that means that you have a way of being able to go across and reinforce yourself against somebody's arm. If you're talking about earlier armor, before you start seeing lots of plate, a person with plate on their arm going against somebody who's just got chainmail, maybe padding underneath, padded gambeson, that shot is going to hurt. It hurts a lot more than I expected when I first started training in it. And so now you have a way of being able to weaponize your arms in deflection and offensive and defensive capabilities. So that's a part right there that I think is very important to consider. So plate allows for deflection, but it also allows for impact against on somebody. And, at the same time too, it allows for certain things where I can lay on arms myself so I don't actually get hurt in the process. So if we're talking about plate in general, personally, I think, again, it is more about the concept and understanding of deflection and being able to strike in certain ways. And also to take a strike, because again, if I'm wearing plate against plate, it still hurts, but it's a lot less than if it's bare or padded gambeson against steel. Chainmail to me is more about anti-laceration. And what I mean by anti-laceration here is that essentially it is not going to stop a thrust. There's lots of video evidence out there where they show people, and I actually really like this, because again, it shows the level of how you layer chainmail. They were showing a hauberk, right? So they have a hauberk, which is a chainmail shirt. Then they put on there a bishop's mantle, which is a chainmail collar or coif, where they laid that on top there. And then they put a helmet, which had a padding underneath the aventail, which is the chainmail on a helmet. And they tried to stab through that chainmail piece right here. And it was they couldn't get through. They could not get through. So padded and laced chain really does work against about deeper thrust concepts. But I don't think that that's what it was initially. I personally think that chainmail was an anti-laceration protection. And that being right there where, if I come into, if someone's cutting in these spots right here, right? Well, there's a couple things to really consider there is that, stitching in this area right here of the armpit while it keeps the arms together and allows your arms to move around both for offensive and defensive purposes, it also is a weak point because fabric has been stitched together there. Now, is that a reason why they attack the armpits and the groin and whatnot? Potentially. But I don't think that's the only purpose of it as far as that goes. So why chainmail comes over this right here is because you're talking about something that can be punctured. And even if it doesn't go all the way through, again, there's another thing I did as far as a point test. And that's also linked down here as well, where I have Connor utilizing his sword to push against this right here. And it did not take much for me to feel it. Mind you, that is one layer of chainmail in modern recreation, 8 millimeter diameters as far as chainmail is concerned, and it was not layered, and it was a cotton piece. So again, cotton gambeson. So those are all factors right there to consider. But again, if you're talking about kinetic force action, it is very possible that this is going to go in and it will cause pain to shift off. Now, mind you, this is where the concept of pointing, which we'll talk about later on, I think is very important to look at, because again, we're talking about evolutions of armor. Later concepts, you see the Germans couching the sword under their armpit, much like you do a lance, from what I've seen and observed. Personally, in this case right here, I believe this is probably because of two things, is that armor is improved in many ways, and it has become a change in this. In fact, one of the things that I think is within Ringek, it shows he talked about his fourth position is about couching the sword underneath to stick the point into the person. From my observations of Fiore, you don't really see couching, and the reason why I think that's the case is because I think Fiore's fight is a lot more mobile. And the thing about that is you're focusing on very, very narrow tapered tips, which are made to find points. And the whole point of Fiore is not to break through the chain, but it's to cause pain, make their body turn away, which gets them. And as we look at some of the concepts later on, especially one of the plays in armor, which we'll talk about, which is, I've stabbed you in the chest, but your armor defends you. I'll push you with the elbow and I'll see if your armor is good there. I think that has a couple other context pieces that go with it because pain aversion is a huge portion of it. So that's just chainmail. Chainmail is something right there that helps anti-laceration. It does not help against impact. In fact, I will tell you right now, when I was just wearing an arming doublet and chainmail, at one point in time when I first started off and someone struck across my arms, it really hurt. It did not stop anything. The linen I had there was like 1 or 2, and the reverberation across, because chainmail hangs on me, I felt it go across everywhere. Rather than being 1 point, it went across everywhere where the chain had been struck. Very, very nasty. But again, did the chainmail stop me from getting a laceration wound? Absolutely, but it didn't stop the impact. So those are parts right there to consider when it comes down to armor. The next portion right here is the underlayering right here. Now, depending on the era, the time, and the argument and discussion, and the time of year, and blah 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 blah, what a practitioner in arms is going to wear is going to vary. Okay, sometimes you have cases of people wearing gambesons. Sometimes you have arming doublets. Sometimes you have, and underneath there you have a linen shirt. This to me is very similar to what we're talking about when it comes down to the context of layering of clothing, right? So layering clothing underneath. Why might there be a linen shirt, then a gambeson, and then your chainmail, and then in your plate? Because you're optimizing defense, mobility, and also rash guarding. So one thing I have to do consistently when I train is if I'm wearing a wrestling jacket or a fencing jacket or something like that, if I wear those things, I have to wear a rash guard underneath. And that is because essentially when it comes down to it, every shot that gets hit, I'll chafe. And with armored equipment and armored clothing, that's nothing new. In fact, actually it's tighter to the body, which means that it is, in my opinion, for my skin, a lot more likely to have these things happen to you. And that's a part right there that I've had to really consider with this. So why historically they may have worn linen? Because they're trying to protect against rashing. Now, that is the first layer of clothing. And then on top of that, what are they armed to? Whether it be something that's padded, whether it be a gambeson, whether it just be an arming doublet, whatever. There's certain other levels of linen in there. And that's really going to be your impact protection, in my opinion. It doesn't stop the pain from something coming in, but it does absorb some of that as it is struck against chainmail or plate or any of these types of things where shots may come against, and it dissipates that. So again, does this mean it's going to stop a hammer shot? No, it means it's the mesh area against a heavier defensive area as far as chainmail, and then against another heavier area when it comes down to plate. And in that space, you essentially have like a skin that is really allowed to be held against the body that protects it in many forms and fashions. Now, a big part about all this right here is that to look at those things is to understand that we're trying to protect against different areas of armor and whatnot, as far as wounds are concerned. And that, to me, is one of the reasons why when you see some of the things that Fiore does in and out of armor, he utilizes strikes, grapples, strike. When I say a strike, it could be a sword strike, it could be a pommel strike. It's all strikes, right? And he knows what to hit on that portion because he understands what hurts that type of armor. This isn't like a D&D thing here where I'm trying to roll, D20 for strength to break through chainmail. It is much more surgical where I'm trying to find a point to work on somebody and then to get them to turn or get them on the ground. I also don't believe that this is a period of time where you're seeing a lot of ground fighting. While Yudlev absolutely has a section of ground fighting, it is not BJJ. It is not ground fighting like we think in the modernism. It's more like sprawling out on somebody's arm to contain them, and then to work the knife into lower parts of the body or upper parts of the body as you use your armor and weight to suspend their arms from defending themselves. So, and do I think you can learn that with looking at some of Fiore's concepts? Absolutely. But I think his advice would be, don't be on the ground. Because, by the way, being thrown to the ground, how he throws you to the ground is not meant to be, in my opinion, is not meant to be survivable or to not be uninjured from. So just things to consider with that when it comes down to Fiore's armor. So those are really kind of the big parts right there when it comes down to armor. And the reason why I talk about this right here is because when you start seeing mixed match armor sets throughout the eras, I don't, and mind you, I have no problem. I fought people that wore 16th century armor and I'm wearing 14th century armor. I don't care. That doesn't bother me. But if you're trying to understand a system, a methodology, an approach, you kind of have to look at the period of time equipment and then extrapolate from there. Like I said, the suit that I've been flashing across here, the one that's with me in the Kerberg 13 with the red folds, that is my own work to try to develop a style for myself, inspired off of what I've seen for 14th century. And that would be, in my opinion, a more robust suit than everyone may or may not have had. It may have been more of the cutting edge technology of a time rather than what many people had or could afford or what was even producible at the time because of technique and technology. So please understand that. If we look at that right there, this is the other headspace we have to get into when it comes into armor. And I know, like I said before, this is a big discussion video here, but I think it's important because as we start going into the postures, we're going to see a lot about what I'm saying here because this is how I see certain areas and things happening to a person. Okay. One of the big things, the thing I really want to talk about this here is your modularity and your movement. Now, again, if we're looking at Fiore, a lot of times you see this offline position where he's kind of side tilted. And that right there is an important piece to me because it is very defensive, in my opinion, and it allows for deflection and rotation and power and charging to be all one thing. So that means by being offline in some of the positions that we see, I am both protected and optimally positioned for attack. Every attack that happens within armor essentially is an attack and defense at the same time. Unlike unarmored striking, where I really want to keep away from certain things, it makes a lot more sense to me to move into blows in armor because of how I understand rotations, trajectories, and everything else when it comes down to the equipment that I'm wearing. So the offline positioning, which I know many people out there would say, why would I ever stand offline? Because I want my arm harness in the way. If I don't have faults, I want my arm low because I want my van bracers of my arm to really be in a space to protect my midsection. I want to put my face side profile because if I don't have a visor, I want to have most of my face covered, but I can still see on my target. I can still turn real easily. So we're not talking about buckling or bolting in things just yet. And also at the same time too, I am charged, and as I go into an attack, I'm protected quite well against incoming blows. So that's a big part right here that is to consider with this, is that offline position that Fiore shows consistently throughout his manuscript. I don't think it's on accident. I think he's showing you defensive postures. And whether it be Dente di Chingaro of the dagger section, the sword in one hand, which he says can be both used in and out of armor, any of the sword positions, any of the positions that you see within the unarmored, the armored section of the sword, lance, and axe, any of those positions right there, many of them are offline, and I think that is to optimize defense and offense at the same time. And we'll talk about that. So that's really what I have as far as the basic understanding and observations when it comes down to this. Please understand, now I put all that right there, please understand this next portion I'm going to say here is that one of the reasons why I kind of wonder about this is that a lot of the time, much of the armored fighting, which I've seen in manuscripts, right, they seem more front on in their in their combat postures. To me, this makes a lot of sense because a lot of the armor that you see 1450s beyond is very robust. It's very robust and it's very defensive and it's very effective. And they've gone through this evolution of, chainmail to the Romans, all the way up through chainmail, long habergeons, padded armor and whatnot, and then eventually into augmented plates and whatnot, and then finally into really, really, really regimented plate right at the time when the firearm starts to take over and we start seeing segments between tournament and warfare, which are very similar into the noble class. However, as far as the basic concept, they're very different. And I think that that's one of the big parts right here that we're looking at is why do we see offline positioning within Fiore? It's because we're still in development. We're not at the stage of later on conflict. Why do we see couching in later positions and periods out there? Because you need to have that in place, right? Especially if you're going for robust actions against things. Within Fiore's era, you may or may not need that as much because you may or may not be as plated or connected plated as possible when it comes down to your equipment. So those are just some things out there to really consider. That's going to do it for this video. I know it's a little bit long-winded, but again, I really felt it was important to discuss this conversation here about armor because the world we're going into for Fiore's Armazzari, especially as we go through the Getty, which is dated at 1409, to me, that does not depict when Fiore was doing combat. If he is a 60, 70-year-old man in 1409, and this is like the last work that we have of him, then his heyday is probably 1360s to 1380s, when he's doing a lot of his fighting or getting exposed to fighting and actually doing training. And that's the area where I put my attention to as far as equipment goes. And, because again, what is the tradition that he had, he was exposed to, and was presented elsewhere? Let me know what your thoughts are about that. Because again, as far as I understand it right here, a lot of the armor that you see throughout the 14th century, it does become very robust. The arms race is incredible from the 100 Years' War, especially as, regions of Italy at the time within the Holy Roman Empire are really pumping out a lot of freaking armor, equipment, and weapons and whatnot for all the mercenary companies and different monarchs and whatnot. So you have a huge arms race that's going on, which is why I think a lot of this accelerates in this period of time. But to understand the practitioner at arms, the men at arms, the knight of the time, I think it's important to look at what they may or may not have used, exposed to, and some very basic concepts out there that are important to understand to protect one's life, especially with manuscript that is about doing every dirty, nasty trick to preserve one's life. So again, leave a comment below. Please, if you haven't already, like, subscribe, and share with a friend out there. Want to grow this channel right here, and that's not possible without viewers like you. And as always, everybody, please, until I see you, please stay safe out there, train well, and fight on. I'll see you all soon.